A room above a narrow street in Jerusalem. Oil lamps burning down to their last inch, throwing long shadows against the plaster. The smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs still hangs in the air. Outside, 1,000,000 pilgrims fill the city for Passover, and not one of them knows that history is about to turn on a hinge inside a room they will never see. 13 men lean around a table, too small for the weight of what is coming. One of them reaches out and dips his bread into the dish. And here is the detail nobody preaches. His hand does not shake, not a tremor, not a flicker of hesitation. Across that table, Jesus is watching him, not with rage, not even exactly with sadness, with something heavier than both, the look of a man who has known for years how this night would end, and chose to stay at the table anyway. And then he says it, a sentence so dark, so final, that 2,000 years later scholars still stop cold when they reach it. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Sit with that for a second. This is the same Jesus who let children climb into his lap, the same Jesus who knelt in the dirt and told a trembling woman that he would not condemn her, the same Jesus who told Peter to forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And he looks at one of his own 12 and says it would have been better if that man had never existed at all. What could a man possibly do to deserve those words from a mouth like that? Hold on to that question, because you are going to need it. And here is the question hiding underneath the question. Was Jesus talking only about Judas in that room on that one terrible night? Or was he describing something that still reaches anyone capable of doing what Judas did? Stay with me, because before we are finished, you are going to see this verse the way almost nobody preaches it. This is not a curse. This is not a courtroom sentence. This is not God slamming a door forever. This is a warning, and a warning, unlike a curse, can still be heard in time. I want you to hold one image while we walk through this. On this night there are 2 fires. One will burn with torches in a garden. The other will burn with coals on a cold stone floor. And before we reach the end, one of those fires is going to decide everything. Remember them, because they are the key I am going to hand you at the end. To feel the weight of those words, you have to forget what you think you already know about Judas Iscariot. Everything you were taught in Sunday school. Set it down for a moment. He was not a stranger Jesus picked up off the road. He was not a background figure in someone else's story. For 3 years, Judas ate at the same fires, walked the same dust, and slept under the same open sky as Peter, James, and John. He watched Jesus take a basket meant for one family and stretch it until 5,000 people sat full on a hillside. He watched a dead 12-year-old girl open her eyes at the sound of Jesus calling her. He watched a man born blind blink into the light and see color for the first time in his life. And Jesus trusted him, not a little. Judas carried the money bag for the entire group. He was the treasurer of the ministry. That is not a small detail you skip past. That is access. That is intimacy. That is a level of trust Jesus did not hand to just anyone, which means whatever broke inside Judas did not begin at the Last Supper. Here is what most people miss. Betrayal on this scale is almost never one dramatic moment. It is 100 small surrenders long before the big one. A skimmed coin here, a private resentment there, a quiet decision, made over and over in rooms nobody else ever saw, to love something more than he loved the man across the table. So that night at Passover, the very meal that once marked Israel's rescue out of slavery, Jesus drops a single sentence into the room like a stone into still water. One of you will betray me. And watch what happens next. Every disciple at that table responds the same way. Not is it him. Not point him out. 12 men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years. 12 men who had watched him heal and feed and forgive and raise the dead. And every one of them says the same 3 trembling words. Lord, is it I? Sit with that. Not one of them was confident enough in his own heart to rule himself out. Because if grown men who had seen the impossible with their own eyes could still wonder whether the next betrayal might come from inside their own chest, then what does that say about how quietly any heart can drift? Including yours, including mine. That is the first warning hiding inside the story. The betrayal did not begin with an obvious villain in a dark cloak. It began at a table full of men who loved Jesus, and one of them quietly did not anymore. Now here is where it gets deeper. The word Jesus uses for betrayed in the original Greek is paradidomi. You would expect a word that means to stab in the back, to lie, to deceive. That is not what it means. Paradidomi means to hand over, to deliver into someone else's hands. And here is the part that should stop your breath. It is the exact same word the New Testament later uses for what God the Father did with his own Son. Paul writes that God gave him up, paradidomi, for us all. The same verb, two completely different hearts behind it. Judas handed Jesus over to save himself. The Father handed Jesus over to save you. Read that again slowly, because you are in that second sentence. One hand was payment for 30 pieces of silver. The other was payment for a debt the whole world owed and could never repay. That is not an accident buried in the grammar. That is the entire gospel hiding inside a single Greek word. But there is something stranger still, and it reaches back 1,000 years before that dinner. King David, sitting with his harp 10 centuries earlier, wrote a line about a coming betrayal. And he was not speaking in vague riddles. Even my close friend, the one I trusted, the one who shared my bread, has turned against me. Shared my bread, the exact picture of a hand dipping into a dish at a table. And centuries after David, a prophet named Zechariah, who never met Jesus, who never met Judas, wrote down a number. 30 pieces of silver, the precise sum the religious leaders would one day count into a traitor's palm. Not a similar figure, not a round guess that happened to land close. The exact amount, recorded before there was a temple treasury to draw it from, or a disciple alive yet to receive it. This is what Jesus meant when he said the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. He was not being poetic. He was pointing to ink on a scroll, written long before Judas drew his first breath, and watching it come true in real time in his own dining room on the worst night of his life. If this is the first time the Bible has ever felt less like a dusty book and more like something that was watching for you across 3,000 years, take 1 second right now and subscribe. And tell me in the comments which hit you harder, the betrayal that David saw coming, or the price that Zechariah named before the coins even existed. That one comment is honestly how this channel reaches the next person who needs it. Which brings us to the question theologians have wrestled with for 2,000 years. The same question you have probably felt, even if you never said it out loud. If it was written, was Judas even free? Or was he just an actor forced to play a part he never auditioned for? Look at the sentence again, closely, because Jesus answers it in the very same breath most people rush past. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. That is the plan, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. That is the choice. Jesus holds both at once, in one sentence, with no contradiction between them. God's plan moves through history like a river nothing can dam. And a man, fully free and fully responsible, chooses to step into that current and steer his own hand toward the betrayal. The prophecy did not make Judas guilty. Judas made Judas guilty. The prophecy only told us in advance that someone would. The early church felt the weight of this too. Origen argued over it. Augustine wrestled with it for years, and they landed where the sentence itself lands. For knowledge is not force. God, seeing your choice from 1,000 years away, does not reach down and make the choice for you. He simply is not surprised by it. He is not surprised by yours either. And that distinction matters more than it sounds, because if Judas had no real choice, then this is just old history. A sad story about a man trapped in a script. But if Judas chose freely, slowly, one small compromise at a time across 3 long years, then this story stops being only about him. It becomes about anyone capable of choosing the same thing, which raises something even harder. If Jesus knew from the very beginning what Judas would do, why call him at all? Why hand the money bag, the trust, the access, to a man Jesus already knew would sell him? Here is what most people miss. Jesus never treated Judas any differently than the other 11. He washed Judas's feet the same night he washed Peter's. He let Judas dip his hand in the same dish. He gave him every warning, every open door, right up to the final hour. Jesus did not choose Judas because the story needed a villain. He chose him the way he chooses every one of us, knowing exactly what we are capable of, and loving us anyway, right up to the moment we decide what we will do with that love. The tragedy of Judas was never that Jesus ran out of chances to give him. It is that Judas ran out of chances he never had to run out of. Which brings us to the garden. Later that same night, under olive trees gone silver in the moonlight, Judas leads a company of armed men to the one place he knew Jesus would be praying. Torches flicker between the trees. There it is, the first fire. Swords clink, sandals shuffle over stone in a garden that only minutes earlier was quiet enough to hear a branch shift in the wind. Judas walks out ahead of them, steady, unhesitating, a man who has already crossed so many small lines that this last one barely registers as a line at all. And he has rehearsed his signal, the same gesture a friend gives a friend. He leans in and he kisses him. Luke records what Jesus said, and it is almost too heavy to read out loud. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? The most intimate gesture two friends can share, turned into the trigger for an execution. That is how far the small surrenders had carried him. What began with a skimmed coin ended with a kiss used as a weapon. And no one plans that ending. You back into it, one small yes at a time. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because I think this is the part where a lot of us quietly recognize ourselves, whether we want to or not. Has there ever been something in your life you knew, deep down, was pulling you away from God, and instead of turning back early, you let it grow, one small compromise at a time, exactly the way Judas did? You do not have to answer out loud, but I think more of us carry a little of Judas in us than we are usually willing to admit. And the whole point of the next few minutes is that carrying it is not the same as being lost to it. So now let us go back to the sentence that started all of this. Woe to that man. In the Greek, that word is wari, and it is not a curse handed down from a throne. It is closer to a sob. It is the sound you make standing over a grave, not the sentence a judge reads before an execution. Jesus is not sneering at Judas. He is grieving over him, even while telling him exactly where his road is heading. And then comes the line that makes the blood run cold. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Here is what most people miss. The Greek word for good here is kalon, and it does not just mean pleasant or nice. It means fitting, whole, the way a thing is supposed to be. Jesus is saying that nothing at all would have been more fitting, more whole, than the road Judas was walking to the end of, without ever once turning back. And notice which word he does not use. The New Testament has another word for good, agathos, the word for something morally or inherently good. Jesus does not reach for that one. He reaches for kalon, a word that leans toward fitting, well-suited, matched. And that changes everything. This is not punishment for punishment's sake. This is a mismatch, a soul that was never designed to end this way, ending this way anyway. That is not a verdict on Judas's worth. Every person at that table, Judas included, was made in the image of God and loved by the very man he was about to sell. It is a verdict on what one choice, carried all the way to the end without ever turning around, does to a soul. Some choices do not only cost you something, they cost you everything that could have been. And we know, painfully, how it ends for Judas. After the betrayal, after the arrest, after he sees exactly what 30 coins have purchased, Scripture says he is crushed with remorse. He throws the money back at the religious leaders. He says the words, "I have betrayed innocent blood." And in the weight of that guilt, alone in the dark, telling no one, he takes his own life. I want to pause here gently, because if you have ever sat that close to your own darkness, this matters. That ending was never the only door open to him. It was the one he chose, alone, in the dark, without ever telling a single living soul what he was carrying. And that one detail, alone and in the dark and telling no one, sets up the most important contrast in this entire story. Even the money finished its prophecy. The religious leaders would not put blood money back in the treasury, so they used it to buy a field to bury strangers in. People began calling it Akeldama, the field of blood. You can still find that name on maps of Jerusalem today, 2,000 years later. And Matthew tells us that even this fulfilled words written generations earlier, about a potter's field bought with the price of a man's life. Even the empty seat Judas left behind was written about. When the disciples gathered to replace him, Peter stood up and quoted a psalm written 1,000 years before. Let another take his place. Nothing about that night, not the betrayal, not the silver, not the field, not even the empty chair, fell outside what God had already seen coming. Now hold that image of a man alone in the dark, because here is what the Gospels practically beg you to notice, and almost nobody does. That same night, another disciple also betrayed Jesus. Not to soldiers, not for silver, with his own mouth, 3 separate times, warming his hands at a fire of coals in a courtyard, swearing he had never even met the man. His name was Peter. There it is, the second fire, 2 disciples, 2 betrayals, the same night, the same Lord. One walked out into the dark and never came back. The other went out and wept until his body shook. And here is where the 2 fires finally decide everything. Days later, on a beach at dawn, Jesus builds a fire of coals with his own hands. The exact same kind of fire Peter was standing beside when he denied him. And over that second fire, the risen Jesus asks Peter one question, 3 times, one for each denial. Do you love me? And Peter is restored, fully, publicly, handed a mission, a future, a church to build. Same failure, same shame, same night, completely different ending. And it was not because Peter's sin was smaller. It was not small. He denied Christ to his face under oath, while Jesus was being beaten a few feet away. The difference was never the size of the sin. The difference was which direction each man ran when the guilt came looking for him. Judas ran toward the dark. Peter ran toward the fire where Jesus was waiting. That is the whole thing, if you will let it land on you. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Was never really a sentence about birth. It was Jesus grieving out loud over what it looks like when a soul carries its guilt all the way to the grave, instead of carrying it back to the only person alive who could lift it off. Judas had 30 pieces of silver in his hand and a Savior sitting close enough to touch the entire time. He simply never turned back toward him. Peter had nothing in his hands but failure, and he ran straight to the man he had betrayed. That is the entire gospel, hiding inside 2 disciples' worst night. And in case you think your hands are too empty even for that, remember the 3rd man on the worst hill outside the city. A dying thief, nailed to a cross beside Jesus, with nothing left to offer, nothing left to undo, no time left to fix anything. And Jesus turned to him and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." There was room for a dying criminal. There was room for a disciple who denied him 3 times to his face. There is room for you. Whatever you are holding right now, there is room for you. So let me give you 3 things to carry out of that upper room, 2,000 years later. First, the truth about the words themselves. The most terrifying sentence Jesus ever spoke was never a curse on a life. It was a grief cry and a warning. And a warning is only ever spoken to someone who still has time to hear it. Second, what that means for you. The one truly unforgivable thing in this whole story was never a particular sin. It was not the silver or the kiss or even the betrayal itself. It was the refusal to turn around. Judas and Peter proved that on the same night, at 2 different fires. The distance between them was not the size of their failure. It was the direction they walked next. And third, the one I most want you to feel. Jesus is still at the table. The bread is still being passed. He already knows the worst thing you have done, and the compromise you are still feeding in the dark. And he has not gotten up and left. Somewhere tonight, someone hearing this is quietly deciding which disciple they are going to be. The one who lets the guilt carry him into the dark alone, telling no one. Or the one who gets up, walks back through the door he ran out of, and lets the same Jesus who already knew exactly what he would do still call him by name. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born, but it would be everything for you if you turned around tonight and walked back toward the fire. He is still there. He never left. He is waiting for you. So tell me in the comments, which fire have you been standing at, and which one are you walking toward now? I read them, and I promise you are not the only one typing it. If this pulled back a layer of scripture you had read 100 times, but never really seen, subscribe and stay. Because the next verse we open is going to do the same thing to something you thought you already understood.